Additional sanctions on Iran are supposed to go into effect today, that amid growing tensions within the country. The move follows a reported cyber strike against Iranian military computer systems in response to Iran's downing of a U.S. surveillance drone last week.
According to U.S. officials, the cyber attack disabled systems that controlled rocket and missile launches. Meanwhile, Iran says that it showed restraint by not blowing up an American plane accompanying an unmanned drone, allegedly flying in that country's airspace. Here to discuss the continuing tensions with Iran is the founder and president of the National Iranian-American Council, Trita Parsi. He's an expert on U.S.-Iranian relations, Iranian foreign politics, and the geopolitics of the Middle East. Welcome, sir.
Glad to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming on, sir. Let's go into the reported strike. What do you believe that the administration's calculus was for canceling the strike? Is it as simple as President Trump just learning the death toll might have been 150?
It's very difficult to believe that it was that simple. I mean, certainly the death toll should have been communicated to the president much earlier. But I think what is interesting is that if the only option he was presented was one in which 150 people would get killed in response for a downed drone, it sounds to me as if the military actually was putting forward a proposal that they knew that he was going to nix. Because at the end of the day, we have had numerous cases in which the United States has been very close to striking Iran over something. And in almost every one of those cases, the reason why the United States chose not to was because the military said, we cannot control what will happen afterwards. You will not have control over the escalation, and as a result, it will likely lead to a major confrontation.
And based on your expertise, is that analysis correct?
It certainly is correct. The idea that there's such a thing as a limited strike on Iran is frankly preposterous. Iran is not Syria. And I think what we've seen right now is very clear indication of that. Just a couple of weeks ago, when the USS Abrams was moving towards the Middle East, US intelligence picked up that the Iranians were starting to move around their missiles, putting them on boats. John Bolton tried to present that as an offensive maneuver by the Iranians. The US intelligence concluded that most likely this was a defensive maneuver, making themselves ready to retaliate if attacked. So right there we had clear indications. If there's a strike, they're going to retaliate. If that retaliation leads to American casualties, rest assured the United States is going to step it up even further. And before you know it, you actually have a full-blown conflict.
Dr. Parsi, you actually had an insight into the strike itself. Now, it seems that there was some disconnect between what the congressional leadership heard and what the president is telling us what the actual strike would have been.
I got a phone call from a colleague on Capitol Hill saying that they just heard from the Pentagon that it's going to happen within half an hour.
And this was on Thursday.
This was on Thursday. Time passed, and of course we saw that it didn't happen. But it seems like there was a bit of fog of information there because a lot of people were under the impression that this was a go, it was going to happen, it was a very short time frame, and then of course the president, for whatever reason, pulled back.
And this was on Thursday. If we think back to that time, there was a meeting with some congressional leaders, and the White House, was it one of those individuals who's in the room or had knowledge of what was happening?
No, this is a staffer. I don't believe they were in the room at the time, but they heard it from the Pentagon directly, not through the briefings.
Very interesting. Well, another thing we wanted to get your take on is just generally the administration's endgame here. President Trump says, I'll meet with them, no preconditions. The only precondition is you cannot have nuclear weapons. Why is it that we have not seen the Ayatollah or anybody in the Iranian leadership who is willing to meet with the United States?
For a very simple reason. While Trump is saying no preconditions, I don't want to have a conflict, I want diplomacy, John Bolton and Mike Pompeo are walking around talking about regime change, talking about 12 conditions that are nothing short of Iran's total capitulation. What are the Iranians supposed to believe? Moreover, the Iranians are hearing directly from the North Koreans that you actually can deal with Trump. He wants to make a deal, he gives, he takes, but the problem is nothing gets implemented because it's sabotaged by Pompeo and by Bolton. In fact, the North Koreans have publicly stated they're not going to go back to the table as long as Pompeo is part of the US team. No politician in Iran can afford another negotiation with the United States in which the US does not live up to its end of the bargain, which is exactly what happened with the JCPOA. Politically, that's suicide for any of the politicians there. I suspect if Trump lets go of Bolton and potentially Pompeo, it could actually open up some space in which the Iranians actually would start at least beginning the first movements of diplomacy. Wow. But as long as they're there, it's political suicide for any Iranian to agree to this.
So President Trump was obviously on Meet the Press over the weekend talking a lot about Iran and his sort of analysis of his strategy, how he sees it playing out. Let's take a listen to some of that.
As you know, we've done very massive sanctions. We're increasing the sanctions now. But the response is always going to be very strong. I think that they want to negotiate. I don't think they like the position they're in. Their economy is absolutely broken.
How much has their economy suffered? And also, we're supposedly going to have more sanctions placed on Iran today. I mean, what is there left to sanction?
Their economy is suffering tremendously. There is no doubt about that. These sanctions are hitting the Iranian economy tremendously hard, and mostly, of course, the ordinary people who have no ability to be able to circumvent these sanctions. I think the miscalculation on Trump's end is that he believes that economic pain automatically will lead to political softening on the Iranian side. That is not what happened last time when the Obama administration managed to get the Iranians to negotiate. In fact, from the position of the Iranian leadership, it actually is a worse situation for them to come to the table as a result of the sanctions and essentially negotiate their capitulation than for them to stand firm and even risk a military confrontation.
Do you see any parallels between this and the outbreak of the Japanese conflict with the United States, which is, the essential U.S. sanctions on oil? Are we falling into that trap of there are no more sanctions left, complete and total destruction of the economy, leaving the regime little choice, particularly those at the very top of the regime?
I think so, and here's the thing where I think there's a significant mismatch between what Trump wants and what Bolton and Pompeo may want, at least Bolton. Trump, I think, generally wants negotiations, and he has convinced himself that this strategy of maximum pressure and sanctions actually will lead to negotiations. All the evidence we have, not only of previous cases, but of this case as well, is very clear. On the contrary, this type of a strategy actually pushes both Iran and Trump into a corner in which military confrontation is increasingly likely. And when push came to shove, and these advisors had to decide, are they going to be advocating for restraint or military strikes? Well, guess what Bolton advised? Guess what Pompeo advised? They advised to go for military strikes. And I think that was been their endgame from the very outset. This is exactly the reason why the Saudis are so supportive of this strategy, precisely because they want to lead this to a military confrontation between the US and Iran. So while Trump seems to have the capacity of pulling back, once put into that corner, at least this last time, we don't know if it's going to happen in the future, he has not yet concluded or drawn the connection that the reason why he is constantly on verge of war with Iran is because of his maximum pressure strategy. If he wants negotiations, there are paths to that negotiation that is far more effective than what he's pursuing right now.
So we also learned that we did go forward with an offensive cyber attack on Iran last week, starting on Thursday. Talk to us a little bit about Iranian capabilities in the cyber arena to strike back.
So the Iranians, for reasons that the head of Google said we do not fully understand, have quite remarkable cyber capabilities. Certainly far greater than what their military capabilities are. And this is an area that is a bit risky for the United States, of course. Without a doubt, the US has the best cyber capabilities, but the ground is a little bit more even than it is when it comes to military capabilities. Of course, when it comes to military capabilities, the United States is completely superior to the Iranians. But it is a little bit more even when it comes to cyber. And that's part of the reason why the US in the past have been a bit careful about cyber attacks, because the Iranian retaliation on that area has two major challenges. On the one hand, they're actually somewhat more capable, but also we don't have international law that regulates this. So we don't know at what point is a cyber attack from the Iranians actually an act of war. So it's a little bit of uncharted territory and a little bit dangerous, but certainly from the Trump administration's perspective, or Trump's perspective himself, better to go forward with that rather than a military strike that would leave 150 people killed and would escalate into a full-blown conflict.
So we've seen the situation is at the tensest that we've seen probably since the beginning of the Trump administration. Where does the tension go from here? Will there ever be a path to negotiation? Say John Bolton remains, or is some sort of outbreak of conflict inevitable?
If John Bolton remains, I find it very unlikely that there will be any type of negotiations. And I think the Iranian strategy that existed prior to 2 months ago, which was to just wait out Trump, clearly they have shifted away from that, which is mainly because of the Trump administration opting to get rid of all of Iran's oil from the oil markets. One of the things that can happen is that both the Chinese, the Russians, and the Europeans, realizing that their own rather relaxed attitude towards this, in which they have said very positive things about the JCPOA and said that they want to stay in it, but they've done very little to provide the Iranians with the economic benefits that they were promised. This may now change their minds because they realize if they don't step up and actually provide the Iranians with some economic breathing space, this will likely lead to a major military confrontation, which would not be good for any of them.
Take us a little bit inside of Iran. What is the domestic political pressure pushing this regime in the direction of?
So there's long historical things. I think it's important to keep in mind this is a regime that is very, very unpopular on many different levels. This regime has been quite repressive. There's a significant amount of disappointment with Rouhani because a lot of people expected that he would secure the nuclear deal, economic situation would get much better, and from that there would also be an opening of the social space. Now, some of that has happened, but because of the collapse of the nuclear deal, the economic situation is much worse now than it was before. And like in any other country, nothing matters more than the economics. So people are unhappy, and they're also blaming the regime for many of these things, but increasingly it's difficult to put the blame on the regime, mindful of the fact of what the Trump administration is doing with this constant escalation. But for them, giving up and essentially capitulating to the United States is complete political suicide. They will lose all of their legitimacy if they were to do so. There is no way out for them. That's part of the reason why it is actually much clearer incentive structure for them to stand firm, even risk a military confrontation, count on Iranian nationalism and rallying around the flag, rather than coming to the table and essentially have to completely cave into Trump's demands.
Final question for you, sir. Does the United States have any more leverage on Iran that they can use in order to push them in the direction that they want?
There's positive leverage, and this is where I think the Trump administration has rather failed. There's positive leverage. I think one of the things the Iranians must have concluded by now is that there is no value of making any deal with the international community that lifts American secondary sanctions, meaning the sanctions the US imposed on the Europeans for trading with Iran, but doesn't touch America's primary sanctions. Those are the sanctions that the US imposes on its own companies. The JCPOA only lifted secondary sanctions. Europeans, Chinese, Indians, everyone else could go into the Iranian market, but not American companies. That doesn't work because of a very simple reason. None of those European and other companies were really willing to commit to the Iranian market because they were continuously fearful that the US may actually reimpose sanctions. The only thing that gives international companies the confidence that they can go into the Iranian market is for them to know that they're doing exactly the same thing as American companies are doing. Meaning once the primary sanctions are lifted and American companies go into the Iranian market, at that point the others would follow as well. So for any future negotiations, the Iranians will have to accept the primary sanctions have to be lifted. Some of them want it, some of them are fearful of it because some of them don't want the United States to re-enter the Iranian market. That's one of the biggest fears that they have. So for any future negotiation, it's interesting, the Iranians will have to accept the main thing I think Trump wants. When you look what Trump was saying prior to becoming president, his complaints about the nuclear deal was that it's unfair. Why do the Europeans get to go and make money in Iran but not American companies? So there is a pathway to a bigger deal that actually could work, but it's not the pathway that Trump has chosen.
Interesting.
Very interesting. Great to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Appreciate it.
Next up on Rising, the U.S. is already adopting 5G technology, but recent wariness over potential Chinese spying is forcing tech companies to change up their game.
Will the United States 5G tech catch up to China's? Tech authority Nate Snyder will give us the odds when Rising returns.